Thank you for this invitation. I'd like to say a few words of gratitude to Docomomo and their fantastic work that you've done, and I think it's a very important initiative, and so we all thank you for this. I will talk about the refurbishment of the Neue Nationalgalerie. It will be the center of the talk, but I do want to position this in a slightly wider conversation about the issue of conservation and the protection of buildings, and also not only the protection of modern buildings, but the general issue of protection, because we found ourselves, quite surprisingly, more and more involved in this discussion, even though we began as architects. I never thought as a young architect that we would be, in a way, dealing with this issue much more. I mean, I was trained by architects who believed that in the future, and in a way had a certain impatience about old buildings. The work that we're doing on the New National Gallery is not easy. It's a very complicated project, and in a strange way, we have nothing to win. I mean, all we can do is make a mistake. If we don't make a mistake, then we've succeeded, and you won't know what we've done. But if we make a mistake, you'll know what we've done. It's a very stupid commission for us in a way, a huge responsibility where if we're successful, you won't know that we've been there. It's a monument, and it's a monument that is by now loved by the city, not maybe university, but generally. And I would say to some degree, while I would say it's not an easy project, I would say the protection of monuments is a little bit easier than other things. Why? Because societally, it's not impossible to persuade people that we should protect monuments. The fact that the New National Gallery has been valued as a monument is an important thing in itself. But in a way, I would say there are other questions about protection which is more to do with the non-monumental, the protection of non-monumental buildings, and I want to talk a little bit about that. Having said that, I would say again that the conditions we have at the National Gallery are good. Firstly, because societally it's accepted as an important monument. And secondly, the professional environment within which we're working estimates this work as being something of great seriousness. In other words, we're not, as we often are as architects, trying to persuade others that what we're doing is important and the quality of what we're doing is important. In a project like this, I would say we're privileged to be surrounded by people who regard the task as importantly as we do. That's important. Thirdly, I would say, in this case, there's no big discussion about its use, because one of the challenges of protecting buildings is often wrapped up with the issue of use. Of course, in the case of the National Gallery, it's a consistent use, and it will remain being used in the way it's always been. Very brief, so in a sense, I don't want to underestimate the work that we're doing, but on the other hand, I would say and I will show the complexity of that, and how the team, and I think Sascha Schwarz, who is the project leader, design director here, and Martin Reichhardt, who's the managing director in charge of the project, they are much more embedded in this task than I am, and it has a certain heroic dimension, but I would say that it is within the sort of accepted territory of monument protection. We are involved in a number of projects. This is the Saarn and American Embassy in Grosvenor Square, where we are working, and these projects are slightly more typical of the challenges of protecting modern buildings, insofar that they're going from one use to another. And I would say that carries with it more challenges than the formal and technical issues of protection itself. In other words, what is the commercial climate that allows one to carry out these works? And of course, as soon as we are in a commercial environment, then the protection that one might be offered on a project like the New National Gallery is no longer there. All of a sudden, we're in love with beautiful thin windows that Saarinen designed, and of course, the investor wants to take them away and replace them with aluminium, because why would we spend money trying to protect architectural quality that no one will benefit from? Of course, in these projects, there's also we are part of the process of helping them survive through their modification. So you'll notice on here that we've rather surreptitiously improved Saarinen's original project by putting 2 more floors and giving the project a sort of commercial viability, and re-bringing the sort of bastion of the building into the city. This is another project where within the French, within the Paris Réinventer Paris project initiated by the mayor, a negotiation between the city and investors. I think it's a rather interesting one. Paris has been, unlike London, much more reluctant about the relationship with investment. And these projects have been a very careful negotiation with investors to ensure that the investors give back to the city what the city wants of them. They essentially don't trust the investor to say that we will do this and we will do this, and of course later on proclaim that commercial criteria preclude them from actually doing that, and they can't do it. So there is a sort of strong contract which is in place to ensure how the building is restored, the architectural quality, and as much as anything, I would say the social use and the contribution to the public good. And so again, it's a project where there is, I think, a healthy collaboration in this case. I would say probably healthier than the London version I've shown you, where London does not have the same tendencies to restraint, and on the contrary, has a much more sympathetic attitude towards investment. I would say in this project, the negotiation between the city, which has forced the investors to take the project very seriously, has been a very important one, a very interesting one in terms of how the project has developed. I just want to come to one other important experience I've had in the last years. I was involved, or we were involved in a project in Munich. We were invited by an investor to look at the Alte Academy in Munich, and part of the investor's interest was to knock down a building of the late 50s, the department store Het Lager by Joseph Wiedemann. And the developer was a little bit surprised because the building, the quality of the building is, one couldn't say, and here's the courtyard, you can see the facade. The city was arguing, quite interestingly, that while this is not a high heritage building in conventional ways, it could not be protected in the way that a monumental building might be. But the city argued that this is a contributing building, and if we keep taking these types of buildings away, we will lose the texture of the city, we will lose the things which make Munich Munich. Embedded in this attitude, of course, is a certain skepticism about what will replace it, a sort of wariness that I know you promised us that you're going to use good architects and they're going to put something back better, but we've heard that too many times before and we don't believe you anymore. So it was I found, and in fact what happened is that the city then asked me to be a mediator between them and the investor, so we gave up our commission and instead participated as an office, as a mediator, and I became the mediator between the city. And I found this discussion really quite fascinating. In other words, repeating myself as I will through this, that I think by now we know that we should be protecting buildings of great cultural significance. However, where does that boundary end? And is it only by declaring things by declaring buildings of cultural significance and protecting them that way? Is that the only method that we have? Because that's quite difficult. We can't just go around protecting every building. On the other hand, how do buildings like this, if they're not, as it were, scientifically protected, how do we deal with the non-monumental? How do we deal with the less important buildings? But as they would argue in Munich, if you take all of these away one by one, surreptitiously, you've lost a very important quality of the city. You've lost a sort of layer. You've lost actually part of the spirit of a city, because a city is a sedimentary thing. It's not but on the other hand, it's not a museum, because if we just say, well, this has great value, this has great value, this has great value, let's protect those, this is a sort of museum attitude. So the discussion about protecting of less significant buildings is, I think, critical to our cities. And this is not normally an issue. People don't go around knocking buildings down just for the sake of it. Why is it happening? It comes because of investment. So we're seeing this in London probably more than anywhere else, but I would say this is happening everywhere now, that we are not vandals. We don't necessarily knock down innocent buildings just for the sake of it. But investment clearly puts this question under much more pressure than it would ever have been done before. And investment also now is global investment. So even if we are in a situation where we evaluate the thing in front of us, in other words, you say, are you sure you want to spend 3 years knocking this down, building back, and wouldn't it make more financial sense to protect it? You say that. Actually, it would do if you were discounting the energy of global money. Because global money doesn't worry about things like that. Basically, it wants to posit itself and leverage the value of land. We were involved in Shanghai in such an exercise where the investor wanted to knock buildings down. This is the north end of the Bund, and these are not the grand buildings of the Bund. They were rather mediocre buildings, and you can see that their fabric has been eroded, and they don't have great architectural quality, one would say, just on the sense of it would be very difficult to argue that they are important monumental bits of architecture and significant pieces of architecture. However, our argument was that they contribute and they're significant. And again, if you knock these things away continuously, you lose a layer of the city. And of course, Shanghai was doing that much too much. So this was a project we did in 2000, so 10 years ago. I think the attitudes have changed, but at that time, the idea of protection was something very difficult to argue for. They did accept the notion of protection. The Chinese idea of protection at this point was that absolutely we'll keep it, but actually what we'll do is we'll knock it down and build it again in the same way. And it was very difficult to argue that the fabric itself was important. So we worked on 13 buildings. We persuaded the investors protect the building. I mean, we were supported by the city, but it was something quite difficult to argue for. So that's before, that's after. That's before, that's after. That's before, that's after. I mean, it was a sort of painful exercise. It was very, I mean, in a way, I suppose it's the discussion I'm trying to promote, is how it's a hell of a lot easier just to knock these buildings down than to protect them. You can't necessarily hide behind clear scientific evidence that this is a very important example of this architect, this period of this, you know, which is the typical way that we protect buildings. I think we have to understand that going forward, we must consider a more normalized approach to protection in relationship to development, because it's development that puts this issue into a critical mode. At the moment, development and protection are enemies. They're in continuous confrontation, and somehow through planning we have to think about how they might be seen as opposite sides of the same coin, that they have to be part of an engaged planning attitude, because we can't just keep labeling buildings as heritage, because I think the other aspect of that is that it's become a convenient way. I mean, I think one of the other dimensions, which I think is difficult about heritage going forward, is that we are seeing too many examples where we're protecting buildings, and I would say this is a case in point. We protect these buildings, and now they're full of Prada shops and four-star restaurants. So what heritage have we actually, I mean, we've saved the bricks and we've done something which is important. But in what way does heritage become part of a sort of commercial city branding and touristic industry? In many cases, heritage is hijacked by this, and therefore it's become a sort of an artificial process. So my concern is how do we bring heritage into a more sustainable approach? And I do believe that increasingly issues of sustainability will help us. They will actually allow the questions to be asked much more rigorously about why do we knock this building down in order to build something else. We can't turn cities into museums. Cities depend on reinventing themselves. They depend on development. We should not reject development, but I think we need a planning process which somehow manages that. And so that's my little monologue about that. And now I will talk about the protection of a monument, which, you know, again, I don't want to belittle, but in some sense, we are working amongst, you know, within a benign environment where clearly we have museum directors as clients and city historians and building historians who are absolutely engaged in the project. It's a strange building, and as we've, you know, I mean, many people who have been in the building before it closed were a little bit surprised that it needed such a substantial renovation. What we have discovered, I mean, we did term our restoration a soft restoration early on, and it's come back to haunt us, because those of you that will go tomorrow will see a sort of quite shocking deconstruction of what seemed to be a fairly intact building. Mies's building was technically flawed. The temple was, the glass facades are really uninsulated. They're just giant cold bridges, which caused enormous problems. But less evident to us was that the socle on which this thing stands, the base, all of the concrete work and all of the more masonry things were really poorly constructed. So as we peel layers away, we end up peeling layer after layer, trying to find something, a place to stop, and it doesn't come easily. The building alludes, in a way, to being a technical building. It has this aura. It's an American building built in post-war Berlin, in West Berlin, with little resources, but with the aspiration to look like a sort of, a piece of sharp modernism. It's only by undoing it do we discover how handmade it is. I think the other interesting thing through the life of the building is that there is great affection for the building now, but it's an interesting affection because the building at the beginning was not particularly loved. There was a sense that Mies had brought this project from another city, from Cuba first of all, and then Schweinfurt secondly, and finally he found a convenient place to park it in Berlin, that it hadn't been designed for the city, but more it was a priori idea that Mies finally found a place for. It's a hall which is nearly, sort of hopeless as an exhibition space. The first generations of curators struggled enormously with how to hang works in a glass hall of more than 8 meters tall. When challenged, Mies conveniently said, well, I found the concept, the idea so fascinating, I felt obliged to follow it, which I think is a very good line for architects to use, but I'm not sure it's, most of our clients would accept such a justification. So it began its life not as popular societally as it is now. It was not particularly working well, and it was full of condensation. So, in a way, a hopeless building that gradually over time became more and more loved. The extraordinary element, I would say, of the building is the roof and the 8 legs, which was constructed, as many of you know, was constructed on the ground and lifted up with the legs in place. This steel temple, which I think is the magical element of the project. It's because it's both substantial and insubstantial. It's something which has an enormous power. This heavy roof sitting on these extraordinary tapered 8 columns. It's a beautiful idea physically and also, I would say, ideologically. And this element of the building survived incredibly well. It's in incredibly good condition. It has no, that's the one element of the building which has survived very well. This shows you the evolution of the project from Cuba, the building that he was doing for Bacardi before the Cuban Revolution, sent him away from there. Then he took the idea to Schweinfurt to start building a museum for a private collector. And then he got the invitation from Berlin, and then he excused himself from the collector and said, can I build this in Berlin instead? So this is the evolution of this, and that's why the Berliners were a bit pissed off that this idea had come from somewhere else. I said before that I think that we're often asked, why do you do a project like this? How can it be interesting? Or this is just a lot of hard work and you don't have any creativity. I would say that what's interesting, as architects, we're always sitting on one side of a table, arguing against the other side of the table, which normally is many more people than us, about the importance of certain things, about the window frames are going to be important, about how important that this material is. We tend to be, it tends to be, I don't want to sound paranoid, but we are often in a sort of us versus them position. Why do you need to use this? This one is cheaper, why can't you use that? We're normally slightly on our own arguing for quality. slightly on our own, trying to elevate dimensions of architecture which we believe are important and most people don't. So we have to be either surreptitious by not talking about it too much and just trying to hide it, or we have to be confrontational, or we have to try to find collaboration. In a project like this, I would say it came for us, first of all, the Noise Museum, because Noise Museum could not have been done without an incredible collaborative effort. I mean, we could not have made the 12 million decisions that we made in confrontation. We had to create, first of all, an attitude of collaboration. And this is also true on this project. What's very interesting, when all of you around the table have the same belief in the importance of the project. So it's not just the architect, but it's the conservators, the client, everybody surrenders themselves in this case to the importance of the Mies building. It's nearly unquestioned. In a way, it's quite surprising. You know, why should we be spending so much money to repair a leaky and failing building? This is not really on the table. What's on the table is a sort of common desire to, it's nearly a sort of archaeological fascination, a sort of, and the sort of intellectual rigor and the professional rigor becomes fundamental to the whole climate. So, and this is something which we enjoy very much in this process, and I wish it was slightly more prevalent in the normal architectural practice. Of course, there is a sort of archaeological dimension to it. We obviously did a huge amount of research into, you know, we have all the original drawings. We went, you know, we have records of how the building was built, and the team, Sasha and Martin, took the team and clients to look at Mies buildings in North America and Canada. The center of the, one of the focuses of the, and probably the most difficult aspect of the restoration concerns the facade. The facade has no thermal break in it. It's extraordinary. It's, I mean, everything is first of all single glazed, and all of the steel is without thermal break. That has meant that over time, here you can see condensation on the inside of the window. So first of all, we get condensation. Secondly, the steel rusts. The facade, which is designed to move, stops moving, and then the glass breaks. So it's a, and the condensation was even anticipated. So there's little water collectors inside the building for the condensation. And, you know, as we take the facade, as we started taking the facade down, we discovered the issue, the thermal issue, and this diagram is talking about the issue of the movement of the facade. Now, I'm going to go to this. So, on the very top is the existing condition. You can see no thermal break, single glazing, and actually there's no capacity for expansion. The bottom image is sort of what we should be doing if we were to bring the building into line with thermal requirements. So you can see that would be technically the responsible thing to do. But we changed the Mies temple from a Miesian temple into something completely else. And in a way, this discussion was central to everything. And if we failed on this, if we'd ended up in variant 2 or variant 3, I think we would have been in a bad place. And of course, we had to mediate as architects between the technicians on the one hand and the historians on the other. And we had to become the reasonable arbiters, the referees this dialogue. It's no good us saying it has to be this way. It had to be a composite decision, a collective decision, because by achieving what we've achieved, which is tiny modifications, that, you know, we've laminated the glass, we've got movement into the facade, but we accept still a non-insulated facade. This has enormous implications, and the client, in a way, and the technicians had to accept that, and they had to buy into that. And the only way they could buy into that is by understanding the implications, formal implications. So in all of these things, I mean, again, I would say one of my experiences always is a frustration that it's very difficult to get people to consider criteria which is not theirs. Try to persuade a traffic planner that slowing traffic through a town, through a village, is important for the urban quality of the village. Because the traffic planner says, I don't care about that. I'm interested in maintaining 50 kilometers an hour because I'm a traffic planner. I'm not an urban planner. So who persuades a traffic planner that this has implications? Who tries to create an understanding of criteria outside of the criteria of the particular responsibility? And this is what this exercise was, in a way, to mediate between singular points of view criteria, between the historic buildings department, who have one view, and engineers who would have another. And I would say this discussion was totally central to our work. It's not about sitting at drawing boards coming up with clever ideas. It's to do with, you know, it goes to the heart of it. So we've, and clearly, you know the building well enough to know that these technical issues had severe implications. Gradually, the glass, you can see the original glass panels, which were single, then finally got replaced with split ones because it was too expensive to keep doing it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, the quality of the building was continuously eroded by this issue. So one issue was the facade. I would guess that's probably the most obvious one. The temple, in a way, carries the building, and I would say gives it its sort of utopian dimensions. I think that one of the reasons that everyone loves this building is because of its, I would say, nearly utopian atmosphere. It's a building beyond normal pragmatic concerns, as we've discussed. And as I've sort of said, you know, Mies was nearly, you know, he managed to disentangle strict technical and programmatic issues and subordinate them to another idea. The Sokol, on the other hand, is a much more prosaic and simple space, and in some ways rather charmless, with this 6-meter grid of columns. I mean, you wouldn't really design a museum like this with a fiber ceiling, a horrible sort of panel ceiling, which in its day was obviously an expression of modernity, but 50 years later, it just reminds us of every bad office ceiling in the world. Quite poor lighting, and a carpet of you know, mediocre quality. So what is the status of a fiber ceiling? Clearly, it's fundamental to the project. As was the carpet. I mean, the carpet was one of the big discussions. The museums would have liked to replace the carpet, but we felt very conscious that the carpet was part of the atmosphere of the building. So as we started stripping the building away, underneath this apparent sort of highly technical building was actually a rather handmade building with pieces of wood connected with bits of wire, with sort of handwriting on, you know, very house-made, you know, I mean, you could feel a very untechnical dimension to it, quite shocking in a way. And as we peeled layer after layer, we were just shocked about how each surface, it was a bit like, you know, pulling a wool on your sweater, you know, it just kept pulling, and then finally there's nothing left. And here's the beautiful garden, gone. And I would say, those of you going tomorrow, be prepared for quite a shock, because the illusion has gone. This building is, you know, full of illusion. When you see it at this moment, it's very, you know, you realize how thin, whereas the temple is something immovable, nearly Egyptian in its tectonic gesture. The rest is absolutely, the socle is not that. These nice Garda Rover elements, again, are not together, bits of stained plywood, some bit, I mean, really shockingly made. However, it's Mies, and every element has a sort of magic to it. We've given value to those pieces. Everything is removed. We've removed 30,000 pieces, stone, metal frames. All the metal frames are being reused. They're all taken away, cleaned, straightened. They're all numbered, and they come back. So it is, as we've applied a sort of archaeological strategy to a modern building, and a modern building that is full of, you know, this is not it's not Roman brickwork or something. I mean, rather poorly constructed ceilings. The only other thing that we've done, which will have some tangible result, but again, I think it's more to do with tidying than it is to do with imposing. We've done some replanning, especially infrastructure. I would say something, you know, I would say that one imagine that Mies was never that interested in functionality generally. I mean, if you take the temple as an example, you certainly agree with that. But I think what was surprising is that the building has been in consistent use, and generally, for instance, the back of house areas, the office areas, all of this have surprisingly not been that modified. I mean, if you go into most museums, you will find behind the scenes a most appalling series of modifications that's happened over time because of the inappropriateness of the planning. But I would say, actually, Mies's planning is pretty clever because, again, he keeps a little bit of distance between the functionality and the spatial planning. There's a certain amount of diagrammatic looseness in the planning and generosity. However, there are a number of infrastructural issues which are to do with bookshop, Garda Rover, and restaurant. So these two pink elements, you remember, one is the bookshop and the other is the Garda Rover, which was in a way rather provisional, as you can see. So we've moved those things around. We've rehoused the bookshop, we're redesigning the restaurant, and made a much bigger Garda Rover in previously a technical space. And this will be the new Garda Rover. And then finally, the only other major intervention that we've done is some more storage built under the podium in front of the building, under the steps, and that's the last intervention. So I can't really finish on art storage space as the climax of this lecture, but I guess I have to. You know, I mean, in summary, I guess the things I was interested in communicating is one, of course, that we absolutely have to protect monuments, and we have to take this seriously. And I would say I admire enormously the fact that in Germany, a project like this will be properly done, that the appropriate resources will be given to it. I've been in a discussion in the Glasgow School of Art, and I'm talking to them in a few weeks' time. And I think the Glasgow School of Art has to be rebuilt as a copy. But what worries me is that they will not allocate the proper funding to it and the right level of anxiety and care and intellectual rigor to it. And again, I would say that's something which, you know, is here in Germany, especially in Berlin, in our experience, both in Neues Museum and other projects. I think that's something from an Anglo-Saxon world I really respect, the professionality and the seriousness, and the idea that such a task is taken so seriously. But I would say the second part that I would like to say is that I'm not saying that this is an easy exercise. I think it's an exemplary exercise. I think it's important, but I think that the challenges of protection and conserving not just buildings, but our larger environment, which I think is fundamental to our identity, because I think that, you know, I don't know whether you heard, but we have a problem in Britain called Brexit, and it doesn't seem to be going away. And I would say a large amount of the protest that fuels that is a sort of sense of hopelessness that exists in large parts of the community. And I would say that that's exaggerated by where people live, the environment where they live. You just have to travel around the north of England, and I have to say, if I was living there and I was asked to make a protest vote against everything, I would probably also make a protest vote. And I think we're underestimating the importance of our built environment. We've somehow shifted from a post-war period where I think we didn't underestimate the role that architects and planners can play in making the built environment, and now, certainly in the Anglo-Saxon world, this is now the territory only of investment, and investors who are not particularly interested in things beyond the project itself, the commercial concerns. And I think that this is going to be fundamental to going ahead. And I think protection of buildings, not just monuments, is fundamental to the identity of where we live. And that's something that we have to take on more seriously. Thank you very much.